Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Felicia, for that introduction. So, it's good to be here. I've never visited this campus before, so I'll probably take a tour before I leave. I have a lot of material to cover, and it will be science-heavy at points. I hope it amounts to high school biology for some of you, but if you haven't studied high school biology, I think you'll be able to keep pace all the same. And I'm happy to share the presentation and also clarify matters in a Q&A or later. So I have a couple of caveats. First of all, my talk will be about the nature of sexual, not gender difference. Okay, I'm not going to discuss gender values, expectations, and roles. The terms sex and gender have been used in English since the late 14th century. Sex derives from the Latin sexus, meaning male or female. The word is thought to have its origin in the word sacare, meaning to cut. Gender initially was used very synonymously with sex, but by the early 20th century, when sex often come to mean intercourse, use of gender started to gain more ground. And today, gender is often used to refer to just social attitudes, expectations, and roles, manhood and womanhood, right? Here's a chart. It's stereotypical in some ways to explain the so-called sex and gender difference. Now, you might not think there is a difference between sex and gender, but I think you'll grant there at least a difference between, our physical constitution and then sort of the roles and expectations that are often attached to that, right? In man and woman, in common parlance, the gender terms, male and female, are the sex terms. I'm not going to talk about, again, roles, expectations, values. I'm simply going to talk about what makes us biologically male and biologically female, okay? There's another term you may have heard, gender identity. That is a much more recent vintage. It was coined in the 1960s, and one hears it very often in regards to transgenderism, okay? So I'll briefly explain some terms as they are used in literature and popular media. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with one's sex. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity doesn't align with one's sex. So say a biological male who identifies as a woman, or a biological female who identifies as a man, right? They would be called transgender. Agender is another term. Some people think they don't have a gender at all. And there are more possibilities than this. I'm not really going to focus on that side so much, although I can take up some, again, matters in the Q&A. My second caveat is my talk is not primarily theological. I'm not going to interpret Genesis 1 and 2. I'm not going to examine the tradition, right? Instead, I'm going to focus on the science of sex determination as illuminated by Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy. I'm sure you will, by the end of your studies, encounter Aquinas, maybe even the works of in the various schools of Thomism. There's more than one, right? So why am I going to not just do the theology part, right? First of all, I can't cover everything. Why do we need to turn to some of the science? Well, here's an example of why we need to focus on the science. What it says in Scripture gives us the impression that this is how the Earth looks like, right? Now, this is a cosmology that not just the ancient Israelites had, but the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians also had views very similar to this, right? Right, the Earth is a flat disk, the sky's a dome, and this sun sort of moves on a track across the sky like that, right? Well, that picture is outdated, right? We've discovered through geography, geology, and astronomy the Earth is not a disk, nor the sky is a dome, and that Sheol is not beneath, nor the heavens literally above. So what if the division of sexes assumed by the Scriptures is also outdated? What if, I'm not saying we have, we discovered through biology and related disciplines that the sexes are more than two and that someone can be both male and female or neither? Would we then have to conclude that Genesis 1 and 2's authors were mistaken in supposing that God made them male and female? Right? There's that line in Genesis 1, verse 26, God made them in his image, male and female. So we do need to turn to science as illuminated by philosophy, right? Now, why do we need philosophy? and not just science? Well, two scientists can start from the same scientific premises and reach different conclusions. All right? I'll give you an example. Cleft palates, that's a break in the upper lip and mouth, right? Thought to occur in about 1 to 2,000 births. The cause is not entirely known. Could be genetic, could be environmental, could be a combination of those factors. Now, one way to categorize the palate, right? I have an example on this side. I have a non-cleft, and then a cleft palate, and a cleft lip and palate, right? One way to categorize them is to think of them as all normal kinds. That would be odd, right? But that is a possibility. The other option, which is what most researchers and medical health professionals assume, is that A, the intact mouth is the only normal kind, and that a break in the upper lip is abnormal, right? You could appeal to the evolutionary history of the mouth. You could ask what function the mouth has, right? Scientifically, option 1 and 2 are indistinguishable, right? There's no scientific facts that distinguish between option 1, in which all these kinds are considered normal, and option 2, in which only the intact mouth is considered normal and the rest are considered abnormal. Philosophically, one probably makes more sense than the other, right? So we do need to do some philosophy here. Okay? My third caveat is that I accept the Catholic Church's teaching that Adam and Eve are the sole parents of all humanity. That's reiterated in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, right? I also accept the data of paleoanthropology and evolutionary biology. And on that data, modern humans evolved from earlier hominins some 200 to 300,000 years ago from a pool of probably no less than 10,000, right? In paleoanthropology, which is the scientific study of human origins, humans are thought to have a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And our lines diverged about 6 to 8 million years ago, right? And here are some facts about human evolution. Some hominins achieved bipedalism, that is, being able to walk on both feet, about 4 million years ago, right? And then modern humans are thought to have emerged from Africa about 80 to 60,000 years ago, right? And then they spread to Eurasia first, right? And then in other parts of the world, right? So that is the standard scientific picture of human origins. Life is about 3.8 billion years old, and our emergence is like a small slice of that scale, right, on the orange part of the time slide, right? And so we've had pre-human ancestors, right? Now, the magisterium's teaching on human origins was first formally enunciated at the Council of Trent. Okay, and the fathers of the Council of Trent were not trying to. The debate then wasn't really about whether or not the human race descended from Adam and Eve. It was assumed, right, that humanity descended from Adam and Eve. The debate was really about original sin, right, and whether or not original sin was passed on by copying or passed on by biological inheritance and whatnot, right? The last dogmatic statement of the Church on human origins comes from Pope Pius XII in 1950, Humani Generis. And that document didn't just concern about itself with the question of origins, right? And Pope Pius was fairly firm in maintaining that the faithful cannot embrace the opinion which maintains that after Adam and Eve there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, right? Now, that's repeated in the Catechism, right? The Catechism doesn't delve deeply into that. It does have footnotes, I believe, to Humani Generis. And again, it's not argued for, it is assumed. I do believe that the data of evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology can be reconciled with the Church's teaching on human origins, okay? But I'm not going to argue for that today, right? There are some well-known Thomistic philosophers doing great work in this area that I'd be happy to refer you to the works of, right? Why do I bring this up? On the evolutionary picture, sex is binary, okay? As I will explain shortly. And that's why it's relevant. So we live in some confusing times. we've seen biological males compete in women's events. Some of you may have been asked at medical clinics, what was your sex assigned at birth? In some Western jurisdictions, prepubescent children have been allowed to take drugs that delay the onset of puberty and then allow them to achieve some characteristics normally associated with the opposite sex. And we hear the claim, not just in the academy, but in popular media, that sex is not a binary, but a spectrum. Right? That's what a spectrum would look like. Now, if people are using the word sex very differently, when one party says sex is binary and the other party says that sex is a spectrum, then there's no dispute, right? But those who think sex is a spectrum, I don't think are wanting to use that word differently. They really believe that there is no clear division between males and females and that there are third and fourth kinds of people that we normally call sexed, okay? So here's the cover of Nature magazine, which is actually very reputable in its field. It's a popular science journal, right? And there, Claire Ainsworth, almost 10 years ago, said, sex redefined. The idea of two sexes is simplistic. Biologists now think there's a wider spectrum than that. Now, most biologists do not believe that, right? There is a minority of activists within, and they're typically younger, in the academy who think we should redefine, the notion of sex. But they all grant that the notion of sex currently being used by biologists, especially evolution biologists, is binary, right? This was the cover of Scientific American in an issue about 2 years later, right? Okay? Now, sex is a complicated phenomenon. It is. It is binary nonetheless, okay? There are all sorts of what we call development of sex disorders that can arise in utero, right? And there are all sorts of variations of anatomy and physiology, right? And if you compare this to animals, the animal kingdom, exhibits far more sexual diversity in the way in which sex is determined. And I'll get to what we mean by determination of sex, right? You also see some pushback. Okay, this is Emma Hilton, the developmental biologist. I apologize for the profanity. Okay, I couldn't find another picture of her in which she quoted something. Okay, and her colleague Colin Wright, also an evolutionary biologist. Oh, sorry, she's a developmental biologist. He's an evolutionary biologist, and they're pushing back against the claim that sex is a spectrum. They say sex is binary. Okay. So before I get to the science part, I'm going to talk about the ordering of nature, and that's a lot to cover under this topic, but I'm going to discuss teleology insofar as it's relevant to the presentation, right? So here I want to distinguish between two types of teleology. Teleology is goal-directedness, right? It's a concept the Greeks, especially Aristotle, first established. Plato played a part in that too, right? So I distinguish between intrinsic versus extrinsic teleology. Intrinsic teleology is goal-directedness, not imposed from outside, but established inside, right? The acorn is pointed towards the oak tree it could become. It's not pointed toward the apple tree it could become, because it doesn't become apple trees. Now, most acorns don't become oaks, right? Still, they're pointed towards that. That is its goal, right? Intrinsic teleology is very different. The goal-directedness is imposed from the outside. The parts of a machine, they don't have the inherent tendency to function together for the sake of the whole, right? A photocopier duplicates documents because that's the way it was designed, right? So I want to be clear on that. The difference between intrinsic versus extrinsic teleology. In one case, you have goal-directedness from within, right? The orientation of an acorn towards the oak tree is entirely internal. It's not like we have to design it that way. Now, I'm going to consider the question of providence in a second, but it is its own goal. Whereas the goal of document duplication is imposed on the photocopier, right? In principle, you could take some of the photocopier's parts, rearrange it, and make a different machine that does something else besides photocopying, right? You can't do that with an acorn. Okay, that nature has intrinsic goals, right? Intrinsic, internal, is not a scientific, but a philosophical claim. Goal-directedness is not proven in science, but if anything, assumed. Now, most working biologists think teleology is a useful fiction. They don't think there's actually goals in nature, right? Those working biologists who are theistic are willing to grant that there are goals in nature, right? But it's not, whether or not nature has goals is not to be decided empirically. You're not going to do tests to find out whether nature has goals. You assume that nature has goals, and then you can ask whether or not they're genuine, right? So organisms flourish when they develop in the way they should. They reach their goals, right? A tree digs deep roots, right? Organisms flounder when they develop in ways they should not. The tree digs shallow roots, right? And there are many other goals a tree could reach besides deep roots, right? It's bearing, firm fruit, growing branches on all sides, right? The very idea that organisms can flourish or flounder can't be called into question, I argue, within biology, or the discipline wouldn't even have a subject matter, right? Biology is a study of life. Life has to take certain directions. Like organisms have to be able to do well and not do well, right? Intrinsic teleology doesn't imply backwards causation, right? It's not like the as of yet to exist oak tree is causing the acorn to somehow grow, right? Nor do we have to impute some sort of consciousness to the acorn, right? It's just the ground it has, its possibilities, right? Intrinsic teleology is what makes it possible for an organism or process to cause effects or be affected. For an acorn to exist, it has to be directed towards certain outcomes and not others, right? Importantly, even when a cause is underdeveloped, damaged, or impeded, it remains oriented towards natural effects. The function of the eyes is to see, right? Blindness, whether it's congenital, right, or acquired, is clearly a malfunction. But even blind eyes have a function. It just can't achieve it, right? Intrinsic teleology is compatible, I argue, with God's creation and providence. While an acorn grows into an oak tree by virtue of its own nature, right, its goal belongs to itself, that organism should have any goals at all is due to God's sapiential ordering of the universe. Okay? Now, it'll be the science-heavy part. Okay? The human genome has about 6 billion nucleotides or 3 billion nucleotide pairs, right? That constitutes about 20 to 25,000 genes. DNA is our blueprint, right? It has the instructions for making proteins, and our body is built up out of proteins. It's defended by proteins. It's maintained by proteins, right? Okay. Those of you taking high school biology know that there are various bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. I'm not going to get into that. Suffice, you just need to know for the purpose of this talk that DNA is sort of a blueprint for making a human in all its complexity, right? Now, most of our DNA is in the nucleus of the cell. A very small portion of it is in the mitochondria. Okay? And I can talk about mitochondrial DNA later. It is important. Errors in mitochondrial DNA replication and functioning can have serious outcomes for a human. And mitochondria is passed on through the mother. But primarily, I'm going to focus on nuclear DNA because that's where all our primary genes are. Okay? So within the body, we have two types of cells, fundamentally. There's germ cells are sex cells, right? For that sperm for the males and ova for the females. Then we have somatic cells. Those are body cells that are not gametes, right? Not sex cells, okay? In humans, the sperm or the ova have 23 chromosomes, okay? In the somatic cells, we have 46 chromosomes, okay? Everyone clear on that? The way our somatic cells, right, our fat cells, our brain cells, our neuron cells, our kidney cells, the way they duplicate is through mitosis, right? In mitosis, an identical copy is made of the parent cell, right? Mitosis is happening in your body right now, right? The way sex cells are created is through meiosis. There's a reduction in the number of chromosomes, right? So you can see on the bottom right hand of the slide that there's half as many chromosomes in those 4 daughter cells as there was in the parent cell, right? These processes, like meiosis is happening in, male testicles and female ovaries, although, a woman's eggs are sort of already set by the time she's born. And a lot of that has happened previously. But these are the ways in which your somatic cells, your non-sex cells duplicate, right, through mitosis and through meiosis. That's how your gametes are produced, and there's a reduction, a halving of the number of chromosomes, okay? In meiosis, you have a process called recombination, okay? And you can see this actually on the previous slide. Chromosomes, they're not X-shaped, okay? They're only, at least, they only appear that way when they're duplicating, okay? But when they're not duplicating, they look like these, worms, right? I mean, right? And they will create what are called chromatids, and then they sort of break, in meiosis 2, so that there's a distribution, right? But you can see that the arms of that blue chromosome in the meiosis, after the DNA replicates, is sort of latched over with an arm of the red chromosome. So there's some exchange of material going on, all right? Okay, this is a slide of what happens recombination, right? That sort of focuses in on that particular part, right? Recombination is the reason why, unless you have an identical twin, you are genetically different from your siblings, right? My only sibling is my younger sister. If I had a brother, and say he was like 5 years older than me, he nonetheless wouldn't be genetically identical to me, right? Because of recombination. There's a mixing up of material so that my dad's sperm, right, is going to have a different sequencing of the genes than the one that led to the creation of my brother, than the one that led to creation of me, right? And that can happen on the female side as well. Okay. So a woman's egg has 22 autosomes. Those are the non-sex chromosomes, right? The first 22 pairs. The last pair there are the sex chromosomes. This individual's XY. That's the karyotype, the chromosome constitution for a male. Right? A woman's egg has 22 autosomes plus an X chromosome. The male sperm has 22 autosomes and either an X or a Y chromosome, but never both. Right? So it's the dad who's responsible for determination of sex. Okay? Fertilization is the fusion of a sperm and ova to yield an embryo, right? You go from haploid is half, right? 23 chromosomes back up to 46, right? Again, this individual is male. The male sperm here had a Y chromosome, right? Right there. And the female's egg only ever carries an X chromosome. Okay? So the normal male karyotype chromosome constitution is XY. Okay? I say normal because I'm going to discuss some abnormalities later. The normal female karyotype is XX. Okay? Again, it's either XY or XX, and it's going to be the last pair, right? See on the bottom of the diploid box on the right-hand side, it's XY, right? That individual is a normal male. The normal Y chromosome, which only normal males have, has the SRY gene. Okay, this gene is very important, and I'm going to discuss what it does momentarily. The normal X chromosome does not. It is possible for the SRY gene to migrate to the X chromosome in the case of a chromosome duplication error, right? And I'm going to discuss some of those shortly, okay? But this is what you need to know for the time being. A normal Y chromosome, which only this standardly males have, has the SRY gene. It's the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is actually a lot smaller than the X one, and I think this is to scale. It's about 1/3 of its size. Finally, the last thing I'll cover is mosaicism. More than one chromosome constitution. This can either happen in utero or after birth. And individuals of this type have a mixed chromosome constitution. Some of its cells, let's say most of its body cells could be 46XX, standard female karyotype. But let's say that when emerge during mitosis, so, and some of the cells become cancerous, it could be 46XX, it'll be 47XXX, because then you have 47 chromosomes, or you lost a chromosome, and you'd be 45X. The errors that emerge in cell replication don't just affect sex chromosomes. They could happen to the other 44. Okay? One of the most well-known conditions that has a chromosomal abnormality underlying it is Down syndrome. People with Down syndrome have 3 chromosome 21s. Right? That's right. So it's labeled. It's called trisomy X, and it's like labeled 47. And then there's a marker for the third chromosome 21, right? Normally we have only 46 chromosomes throughout our somatic cells. People with Down syndrome have 47. Okay? And mosaicism, very rare. Typically happens in utero, but it can happen after birth. And the main cause of that, I believe, is ionizing radiation. Okay? So these people will be represented by something like you would say 46XX, and then slash, 47, and then an indication that you might have an extra chromosome 4 in some of your body cells, right? Now I'm going to discuss the development of gonads and genitalia. Gonads are the internal reproductive organs, genitalia are the external ones, okay? Both a male and female embryo begin with the same primordial structures. Okay? Genetically, the sex is fixed at conception. What sex the child is doesn't become apparent until the 6th, 7th, 8th week. So both male and female embryos begin with very similar structure. Right? It's up on the the top of that diagram. For the males, around week 6, the SRY gene on the Y chromosome, it tells the protogonads to develop in the testicles, right? The testicles produce both testosterone and Mullerian inhibiting substance. Testosterone produces dihydrotestosterone. And around week 8, the testosterone stimulates the Wolffian duct to transform into the epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicles. Those are the organs that carry the sperm from the testicles to the penis. And then the Mullerian inhibiting substance causes Mullerian duct to disintegrate. Okay? For females who lack a Y chromosome, which has the SRY gene, the protogonads develop into ovaries. Okay? They're not stimulated by testosterone, so the Wolffian duct disintegrates. And I can share these slides later, and so don't worry about trying to find out what happens before when, right? And and not stimulated by Mullerian inhibiting substance, the Mullerian duct transforms into the fallopian tubes, the uterus, cervix, upper vagina. So the process is antagonistic, right? And the default plan is actually female, right? Unless the protogonads are stimulated by testosterone, they will develop in the female direction, even in someone who's genetically male. Okay? All right, so you need that testosterone to get testicles out of the protogonads. For the external sex organs, something similar happens, right? Male and female begin with the same primordial structures called protogenitalia, right? Not differentiated yet. For the male, the dihydrotestosterone produced by the testosterone stimulates the protogenitalia to develop into a penis and a scrotum, right? For the female embryo, or baby at this point, right? It lacks testicular testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, so the protogenitalia develop into a clitoris and labia minora and majora, right? The same structure that constitutes a female clitoris could have become a penis, right? Okay? But and again, I want to emphasize, genetically, the sex is determined at birth, right? But you need that testosterone in utero, males do, to develop testicles in the penis. Otherwise, it takes a female path, right? This chart shows how the process is mutually antagonistic, right? You have that's a symbol for the male on the upper left-hand side, symbol for the female, right? What the female outcome is ovaries, uterus, fallopian tubes, right? The male outcome is testicles and a penis, right? And the effect of testosterone continues, way past birth, right? Puberty is the point at which males begin to start outpacing females in growth and musculature, and a lot of that is due to testosterone, right? Okay. This is another chart that shows you the process. It's more complicated than I describe it because it involves more than a few genes on other chromosomes, right? What I want to emphasize is the mutual antagonism, right? Okay, testosterone is that key driver in a male embryo. And if that male embryo, on account of some genetic defect, does not have testosterone, then though he's genetically male, he may have some female looking structures, right? Conversely, if a female embryo is overstimulated by testosterone on account of some genetic defect, she will develop some male looking structures. Now, how did sexual reproduction emerge? All right. Now, again, I'm assuming the standard picture of evolutionary biology. Unicellular life emerged some 3.5 billion years ago, possibly 4. Right? It produced asexually. One way to describe asexual reproduction is like cloning. you're making copies of yourself, right? Right? Unicellular life is not sexed, right? Amoebas are not sexed, right? So they reproduce. The way they reproduce doesn't involve a fusion of gametes, right? There are actually more than a few ways of asexual reproduction. I'm not going to get into that. Suffice it to say that it's a bit like copying oneself, right? And in asexual reproduction, the offspring inherits its sole set of genes from one parent. Okay? That's how a lot of bacteria, archaea, many plants and fungi, and certain animals reproduce this way, right? Sexual reproduction involves a fusion of two gametes, right? And the offspring inherit two sets of genes, one from each parent. Most animals reproduce this way. Some organisms actually switch back and forth between sexual and asexual reproduction, right, depending on environmental conditions. Humans cannot do that. Right? Sexual reproduction is thought to have emerged some 1.2 to 2 billion years ago among eukaryotes, those are cells with nucleuses. Right? Although asexual reproduction is more efficient, right? You don't have to find a partner if you're an asexual organism. Right? Sexual generation leads to more genetic variation. Right? That's the condition for surviving new pathogens and predators in changing environments. Okay? I hope that chart makes it clear, the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction. And again, asexual reproduction takes some different forms, which I'm not going to discuss. But you could ask me later. Now, within sexual reproduction, the ancestral state was isogamy, same size gametes, same size, same structure. Here, the investment from each parent is equal. Right? There are still some unicellular organisms that produce this way, like yeast. So yeast reproduce through gametic fusion. When a yeast gives off a gamete, and so does another yeast. All right? But they're not actually, like you can't say this yeast is either male or female. Right? That's because there's no, although they reproduce through gametic fusion, there's no sexual differentiation yet. And the gametes are of the same size and same structure. Okay? In human sexual reproduction, the condition is called anisogamy, different size, structure, and gametes. The genetic investment, especially from each parent, is not equal. I shouldn't say the genetic investment. I should say the cellular investment. Okay? Most higher-level multicellular organisms are anisogamous reproducers. Okay? I'm going to show a picture later that explains the difference between isogamy and anisogamy graphically. Anisogamy is thought to have emerged out of isogamy several times during the wider evolution of multicellular life from unicellular existence. Right? As some genetic mutations cause some gametes to change size, two strategies emerged. One is for gametes to become small and fast-moving. They have a better chance of achieving fertilization, right, to make the zygote or the embryo, which is the new life. Another is for gametes to become large and slow-moving. They have a better chance of passing on their cellular resources to zygotes and embryos. Okay. So this is the slide I said I would bring up. Right? Isogamy is a form of, in the literature, it's often just called a form of sexual reproduction in which the parents aren't sexed. I find that a bit confusing. I would just say this is just reproduction by gamete fusion, right? Humans are anisogamous reproducers, and not only that, they're oogamous, because the female egg is much, much larger than the male sperm. Okay? And I'm just going to go back to a slide here. The new life, which is all of us at one point, right, acquires most of its cellular machinery from the female egg. What the sperm contributes is genetic material. There's 23 chromosomes, right? But all the big organelles that a zygote, the fertilized egg, needs to start on its course through 9 months of gestation comes from the female ova. So again, humans are anisogamous, and you can, in sometimes literature, we're even called oogamous producers. We're not isogamous reproducers. So what is sex? Right? I have the symbol for male and female down there. I also have down here options that some folks should be listed. There's a symbol for, one is a symbol for transgenderism, but another is a symbol for, like the third symbol implies that, someone could be both male and female, which argues an impossibility. I think the fourth symbol implies that someone couldn't be sex at all. Sex, and I'm just going to state my thesis up front, has to do with potential reproductive role. Okay? Standardly, the scientific definition is that the male is the adult phenotype. The phenotype is a set of traits that produces the smaller gamete. For humans, this is sperm. Okay? Remember, sperm has 22 autosomes plus an X or a Y chromosome. The female is the adult phenotype that produces larger gametes. For humans, this is ova, which has 22 autosomes plus an X chromosome. Okay? So the female egg only has X chromosomes, along with its 22 autosomes. Right? Now, I think the standard scientific definition is correct, but not sufficient. Okay? I'm not rejecting it. I'm just saying more needs to be added. It's only focused on gamete size and structure. But a complete account, I think, is centered on potential reproductive role. The role is potential because not every human reproduces, right? Yet even non-reproducers have an anatomy directed, right, or oriented towards reproduction. Right? Someone who's single and is not reproducing, like my children, have an anatomy and physiology oriented towards reproduction. Again, intrinsic teleology, right? That is the goal of the sexual organs, whether or not they're used. That's the goal of the sexual organs, even if they're damaged. If sex wasn't centered on reproductive power, then what accounts, right, historically and cross-culturally, for the natural unity of humanity? What else is sex about? Now, some theorists think that sex is about like hormone levels, right? It's about the genitalia size and whatnot. I argue that those are related to sex, but they are not sex. Even if one can't reproduce, right, so you have infertility, one is still an offspring of a male and female, right? Even if you're a clone, right, you still have maternal and paternal DNA, right? Even if you don't reproduce, you still have a mother and a father. There's one question we might ask in considering all the scientific evidence is whether or not sex can be attributed to humans in the same way as to animals, right? Is the word male univocal? Does it mean the same thing, in the sentence Fido is a dog and Rover is a dog? Well, here I'm using, I should have said Fido is a male and then Clement is a male or something like that, right? Or does the term male have a different meaning, right? The word bank can either mean a safety deposit box or it can mean a riverside, right? Or is it analogous, right? Whether or not, if we think we're related to other animals somehow, then clearly when we say this dog is sexed, it's male, right? And I'm sexed, I'm male, there has to be a relationship between the two concepts. What it is, I'm not going to say. I think it's analogous, right? The way in which I'm sexed is similar, but not exactly the same way in which a dog is sexed. Now, having stated my thesis up front, I'm going to push back against claims that sex is spectrum, and I'm going to address the three most popular objections. I'm going to argue this is not sex, okay? So sex is not just the chromosome arrangement. I did say that normal male karyotype is 46XY and the normal female karyotype is 46XX. But not all humans have a male or female karyotype that's normal, but they're still sexed. Okay? Some animals, if we think that animal biology has some relevance for the understanding of human sex, some animals don't even have sex chromosomes. They have chromosomes, but not sex chromosomes, right? For certain reptiles, like crocodiles, whether or not an egg becomes a male or female is determined by temperature. Okay? And there are other systems of sex determination that differ from human ones in, say, insects and other parts of the animal kingdom. So, but I'm going to focus on the karyotype question. Okay? Here is a normal chromosome constitution. It should say not normal chromosome, it should say normal karyotype, 46. Here, it's not apparent whether or not the organism is male or female, but it would be judged up here if the author of the graphic had labeled them. We have abnormal karyotypes in instances of monosomy or trisomy. Earlier, I mentioned Down syndrome. Someone with Down syndrome has 3 chromosome 21s. And there are all sorts of conditions that involve possession of an extra chromosome or a missing chromosome relative to 46, right? Remember, in our body cells, we should have 46, in normal body, in a normal karyotype, in our body cells, we have 46 chromosomes, half derived from our mother, half derived from our father, but errors can emerge during cell replication. I'm going to address these, okay? A monosomy and a trisomy are aneuploids, okay? So here's an example of Turner syndrome. This is a genetic female who's missing X chromosome. Okay. On the other side is Klinefelter syndrome. This is a genetic male who has an extra chromosome. There are all sorts of developmental difficulties associated with these conditions, right? A female normally needs 2 X chromosomes for ovarian development, right? And if a male has an extra X chromosome, that also has difficulties associated with it, owing to the fact that you're going to have complications of like cell signaling, right? Every other, you have 22 regular pairs, and suddenly you have 3 sex chromosomes, right? And although he has a Y, right, which has the SRY gene, that extra X poses challenges, right? And if anyone wants to know about the etiology, or the way, and the symptoms of Klinefelter and Turner, I can discuss that later. Okay. All right. Well, this chart covers some of it. It's a bit hard to read, so I'm not going to dwell on it, because I want to explain what an aneuploid is. So earlier I showed you a chart on meiosis, which is how our sex cells emerge, right? How the male sperm and how the female ova are produced. Errors can't happen in this process, right? They're called one type of error is called non-disjunction. Notice how in normal meiotic division, you have a halving of the chromosome set, right? So that the gametes only have half the number of the parent, right? You see the four ends here. There's only 2 chromosomes in each end, but there were 4 up in the prophase, right? So our sex cells, our sperm cells, emerged from parent cells that had twice the number of chromosomes. It's the same with the female ova. When you have non-disjunction, the daughter cells, and these could either be sperm or ova, can have more or less than the number of chromosomes it ought to have, right? This side I'm not going to dwell on, but I might return to it later. So sex isn't karyotype in humans, okay? In humans, sex is determined by the genes, right? The SRY gene on the Y chromosome, which only males have, but it's not identical to it. There are several sex aneuploidies known to researchers, right? So there's XYY males, XYYY, XYYYYY, right? And many of these possibilities were only discovered in the 20th century because we have the technology for examining chromosomes and DNA sequencing. And there are other female aneuploidy. There are female aneuploidies as well, right? X, 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 right? Now, why are all of the list under number 1 they're male? Well, they all have a Y chromosome, right? It has the SRY gene. SRY gene tells the protogonads to develop in either male direction or female direction, right? The ones listed in 2 are all female because they lack a Y chromosome, which has the SRY gene, right? I said Down syndrome patients have an extra chromosome 21 in most of their body cells, right? But we don't think that Down syndrome patients are a second type of human being, right? So why would someone with a sex aneuploidy be considered a 3rd or 4th sex? I don't think they are, and I argue that they're not. Okay? Okay. So sex isn't karyotypes. Okay? And there are animals that rely on other conditions besides sex chromosomes for determination of male and femalehood. Okay? But we know, even in those animals, what makes for a male. It's the one that produces a smaller gamete. And the female is the one that produces a larger gamete. Okay? So the genes are the initial material for sex, but they're not identical to it. Now, this is what happens in the, as sperm or ovum with more than 23 or less than 23 chromosomes fuse. Okay? Then the resulting zygote won't be 46XX or 46XY. It could be 45X, right, or 47XXY, right? Nonetheless, those zygotes are either male or female because it will either have a Y chromosome or it won't. And the Y chromosome has the SRY gene, which I said is crucial for the development of the genitalia and the gonads. Sex also isn't primary and secondary characteristics. Okay? So here's a list of what the primary and secondary characteristics are. And these vary across humans, right? Right? There are some women who have the above average amount of female hair for their sex, right? And some men who are shorter than the average for their sex. Okay? These characteristics do lie on a spectrum. There's no doubt about it, right? Whether it's breast size or facial hair, right? That all varies. Nonetheless, the wide diversity of primary and secondary characteristics doesn't imply the sex is a spectrum, okay? Because you have to separate the expressions of sex from sex itself, okay? I know I might be losing some of you, and I'm going to return to some of that, but you need to remember that we don't all have typical characteristics, right? Even though we're sexed and we're either male or female. Right? And some animals, and again, I'm bringing up animal cases because they have relevance for human understanding of sex, exhibit reverse dimorphism, right? So they're male falcons are smaller than female ones, right? And there are other species in which the female and the mother does like more of the hunting than the male, right? So some thinkers think that sex is multivariable, right? You have at least 4 variables to track here, and gamete size is only one of them, right? This comes from a paper proposed last year by, and these are working biologists, but they think that, well, gamete size, that's just one factor, right? You got to consider hormones and the behavior and whatnot, right? My problem with a model like this is that nothing unifies these factors. Okay? to determine someone's sex in this model, you'd have to measure at least 4 variables, right? And then you have to weigh them, right? And you're going to get a complicated number, right? Right? If sex is just about potential reproductive role instead, which I argue, then hormones, morphology, which means structure, and behavior are related to reproductive role, but they're not the same as it. Okay? So here are 2 ways of understanding trait distribution, because I'm discussing primary and secondary characteristics. Okay? If sex were a spectrum, you'd have an ideal male and an ideal female. And these would be peaks, and everyone else would be either at the peak or they'd be further or near away from them, right? Right? If sex is binary, as I argue, then male and females overlap in the distribution of many traits, but they still form 2 separate populations. Okay? Height is like this. Height is a spectrum, right? There's an average male height and average female height, but some males fall under the average male height, and some females are actually above the average male height. Right? But these primary and secondary characteristics are not sex. They're related to sex. They're expressions of sex, consequences of sex, but they're not sex itself. Okay? So, for example, that men on average are taller than women, owes in part to the high levels of testosterone they have during and after puberty. That females have larger and lactating breasts owes in large part to levels of estrogen they have during and after puberty, right? But breast size can vary, height can vary, right? Those are on a spectrum, right? They are not identical to sex, I argue. Primary and secondary characteristics are expressions of sex, or you can also call them consequences of sex, but they're not identical to it if sex is potential reproductive role. Okay? I could line up all of you, and I could see that all the variations in height, and certainly some men will fall under even the female average, right? And some women will be over the male average, right? That is a spectrum, for sure. But your potential reproductive role, it's either male or female. Finally, I argue that sex is not mating and parental strategy. You have cases in nature that strike us as unusual, admittedly, right? There are 3 forms of the male ruff. A ruff is a type of bird. And in seahorses, the male is the one who gestates the child, okay? How that, that is thought to have developed on account of some evolutionary advantage that it gives the male seahorse because it seems that the male seahorse doesn't need to just spread its sperm the way other animals do. So the seahorses have evolved in such a way that the male, which produces a smaller gamete, now take on I don't want to call it childbearing, but the offspring growth inside of them, right? It's not an exact duplicate of a female womb, okay? But still, the male seahorse is the one who produces a smaller gamete, and the female one is produces a larger one, okay? Okay, the male ruff, it's a type of bird. It has 3 forms, okay? The male ruff has 3 forms, okay? And it owes to a difference in mating and parental strategy, right? So different male forms use different tactics to attract females, but they're all male because they produce the smaller gamete, right? Again, male seahorses have a gestation pouch, but they're male because they produce a smaller gamete. And from an evolutionary perspective, men and women have also developed reproductive strategies that overlap in ways they didn't before, right? Sometimes women pursue men. Sometimes men wear their babies. I wore my child in a baby carrier, right? It was unheard of generations ago, right? Okay? But that doesn't make sex not binary, okay? So mating and parental strategies include in sex, but it's not identical to it. Now, what about intersex? On the right here is someone who has androgen insensitivity. Okay? There was a mutation in the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. And so the bipotential gonad doesn't receive testosterone, and it ends up taking on some female characteristics, right? Because remember earlier I mentioned how the paths can diverge. This person who has complete androgen insensitivity is male. Okay? He's got a Y chromosome of SRY gene on it. But he has female characteristics. Okay? Okay? He still only has the male reproductive role, although he's infertile, right? But even infertile testicles, right, can still have a function. He was on the developmental path to developing testicles, but something went awry, okay? But the path is still there, right? And an acorn may become stunted and never develop into a full oak tree, but the pathway is still there. That's what it's pointed towards. Okay? Similarly, in females, a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia can emerge. This is a case in which the bipotential gonad, the protogonads, are stimulated by testosterone, notwithstanding the 46XX karyotype. Okay? And you're going to get something that is not full ovaries. You're going to have, and vagina, you're going to have a virilized clitoris. That means a slightly larger clitoris than normal, right? But again, a 46XX female is supposed to have developed a certain way. That doesn't change even if anomalies arise during development, right? Right? Something can still have, a body plan can still have functions even if it doesn't realize them, right? It's the goal of my eyes to see, and that is still true of blind eyes. Right? Blind eyes have the function of seeing; they just can't do it, right? But that's what the eyes are, that's what they're pointed towards, right? Intersex is not between male and female, or beyond it. Okay. XY individuals with androgen sensitivity, right? So this individual on the right here, right? They do develop female genitalia, right? But they're still males, okay? They have many female characteristics and they're infertile, okay? But their body plan was oriented towards production of small gametes. And the same can be said with a female with adrenal hyperplasia, okay? There are many other disorders of sex development. Do these disorders imply that sex isn't binary? Nope. Okay? Within the male category, you can have much variation of anatomy and physiology. You can have much variation within the female category of anatomy and physiology. And some females never develop a full set of ovaries and a vagina, and some men do not develop anything even resembling a penis. Still, that was what their body plan was oriented towards, right? And so sex is still binary. What about hermaphroditism, which is popularly bandied about in the popular literature? Okay. Worms are simultaneous hermaphrodites. Worms are, you could either say worms aren't sex or they're both male and female. Every earthworm has a part that produces a smaller gamete and a part that produces a larger gamete. Okay? But they don't reproduce asexually. They do have to reproduce by exchanging gametes. You may have heard that some fish can change sex. Yes, that's possible. Okay? The clownfish, Finding Nemo, that fish can change sex. What does that mean? It can go from producing the smaller gamete to a larger gamete. And that happens because a female leads the colony and the male, and one of the males becomes a female. But that's what it amounts to, right? Okay? Humans are not hermaphroditic, okay? We cannot change the gamete type we produce. nor can we produce two types of gametes. There is a very rare disorder called ovotesticulism, in which an XY individual, okay, a genetic male, can develop ovarian tissue around one of his testicles. Or an XX individual, a genetic female, can develop testicular tissue around one of her ovaries. Okay? But only one reproductive system can be fully functional. In no documented case has any human produced both sperm and ova. And even if an XY individual could produce an egg, he can't gestate a child, right? And that's included in reproductive role, right? Okay? No human being has produced both sperm and eggs. Okay, I discussed these examples like the clownfish, and there are other fishes that can change sex, and earthworms, because these are bandied about in the popular literature by activists who want, to argue that, well, if sex isn't, if certain animals can change sex, certainly we can, right? No, we can't. Okay, we're not like clownfish or worms. Humans are what we call gonochoric. The sexes are in different individuals. Right? We're not simultaneously or sequentially hermaphroditic. So to recap, sex is about potential reproductive role. To have the reproductive power in one way is to be male, and to have the reproductive power the other way is to be female. That power is initiated by the genes, namely the presence or lack of an SRY on the Y chromosome, but it's not identical to it. That's right. So I think that the standard scientific definition of sex is, having to do with gametes is correct, but it's not sufficient because reproduction involves way more than fertilization and birth, right? A reproductive role fully understood is holistic, right? The generative power points backwards to selection of a virtuous mate and the formation of virtuous children, right? When biologists study the reproductive cycle of a bear, they're just not simply interested in all the activity that happens right up until the mama bear gives birth, right? Right? In the reproductive cycle is included the growth of the cubs, right? In an odd way, my wife and I are still reproducing. We're raising children, right? That's a reproductive role, right? We're past the age in which we can conceive new children, right? I'm 49 and she's 50, but we are still reproducing. If you understand the word reproduction in a very wider, more generous sense, right? Now, even though not everyone is or can become a parent, fatherhood and motherhood is what male and female anatomy, physiology, and psychology is for. Okay? Again, intrinsic teleology. Okay? Even when a cause is underdeveloped, damaged, or impeded, it remains pointed at its effects. Even prepubescent and postmenopausal individuals have the generative power. Right? It's either underdeveloped, damaged, or impeded in their case, right? An X individual has a hysterectomy, right? Her ovaries removed, right? She's still female, right? Prepubescent children are still either male or female, even though they can't produce gametes, because they're on a certain developmental path. And some people will remain stuck in a certain part of that developmental path and can never produce gametes. But again, it's the orientation, it's where the path leads to that's crucial in deciding whether or not there are kinds like male and female, right? Right? Priests don't reproduce, right? But that's what the reproductive organs are for. They have a potential reproductive role, right? They don't exercise it, right? Human males and females are not different species, right? But they're different, what I would call modes. I think John Paul II might have used some language like this, and if not, then maybe Edith Stein. But no one wants to say that humans, males and females are different species, right? But nonetheless, what makes for their division? It's a difference in being, right? Males have the reproductive power in one way, females have it in another way, right? Males and females have the same human nature, though. Okay? Sexual difference, I think, gives the human intellect an object to contemplate and the will an object to pursue, right? The male is open to the female as a different other, and vice versa. So my first conclusion, I'm getting towards the end, don't worry. None of the following entail that sex is not binary. Diversity of sex determination systems, the atypical combination of chromosomes, the overlapping distributions of primary and secondary characteristics. Okay? Sex is complicated. Okay? In humans, it's binary and you can't change it. Okay? There may be a variety of reproductive roles, strategies, but that's not the same as a reproductive role, right? And I don't want to reduce our reproductive role just to producing gametes, right? But that's obviously part of what's included, that the fact that males produce, the smaller gamete and females produce the larger one, but females gestate children and males don't, right? So there's already a difference in reproductive role, okay? Now I'm going to take on some challenging questions. Do third, fourth, fifth, and more sexes exist? Not if sex is about potential reproductive role. Because for a third, fourth, or fifth sex to exist, at the very least, you would need a third, fourth, or fifth gamete. And there are none. As seen in evolutionary biology, the emergence of two sexes was costly enough, but also advantageous. Okay? Aneuploidies, right? Abnormal chromosome constitutions don't constitute third and fourth sexes because they don't underlie any third or fourth reproductive role. They're variations within the male category or the female category, but they're not in between the male and female, and they're not beyond it. Okay? I discussed ovotasticularism earlier. Mitochondrial transfer, that's a bit complicated. You might have heard some stories in the media that people can have three parents. That's not the result of three gamete types. It's a result of taking a woman's egg that's healthy, removing the nucleus, and putting in the nucleus that was taken from a diseased egg. Okay, but there's no three gametes. Okay, there's no third gamete type. Right? You can see on that chart there's no third gamete type, although there are three gametes. Okay, there's no third gamete type, right? You're clear on the distinction? Right? There's only two gamete types there. But there was a donor mother who gave her egg, and she had healthy mitochondria, which lies outside the nucleus. And the other mother has an egg with a diseased mitochondria but healthy nucleus. And right? Okay? But if you don't have a third gamete type, you don't have a third sex because there's no third reproductive role at the very least. The second question I'm going to take on is, could anyone have the wrong sex? No. If sex is about potential reproductive role. Now, this claim that you could have the wrong sex can be parsed in several ways. Could there be a transgendered brain in a body? Remember I talked about gender identity at the very beginning. Someone who's biologically male, who identifies as a woman, has a gender identity that doesn't align with his sex, okay? Could there be transgender brains? Right? Well, there's no solid scientific research to establish an association between brain structures and trans identification, okay? More importantly, the brain is very neuroplastic, right? Are trans brains a cause of trans identification, or is trans identification a cause of trans brains? Right? Our brains, develop in response to all sorts of stimuli. Right? And there are activities you couldn't do well if you trained yourself well to nonetheless take on certain activities. You could in some way rewire. I mean, some people argue that excessive use of these, is rewiring us, right? Because we didn't have these when I was a boy, right? And it's possible that constant use of these makes me, like, for example, more impatient, and that could be reflected in a change in the brain, right? Number two, the second way of parsing the claim that someone could have the wrong sex is that you could have a male and female brain in a female or male body, right? Now, there's a lot of research that shows average differences between the brains of typical males and typical females, right? Unlike sex, brains do lie on the spectrum, okay? The typical male brain is bigger than the typical female brain, but typical male bodies are bigger than typical female bodies. You can't just line up brains and put them. It's more proper to speak of the brain of someone who's male and the brain of someone who's a female, rather than speaking of male and female brains, okay? Because brains by themselves aren't sexed. Only the whole person is sexed. Only the whole person feels, reacts, acts. Could a transgendered mind be attached to a body, right? No. That is a form of dualism, right, in which the person is a mind, occupying a body. My response to that is, how could anyone be identical to just the mind? Right? Your body is integral to yourself. It's not a peripheral part. It's not a suit you can just change, right? Again, only the whole person is sexed, and only the whole person thinks, feels, acts, and reacts. And the fourth possibility of parsing the claim that someone could have the wrong sex is that you have a male or female mind attached to a female or male body. But I say, how could you just be a mind occupying a body? Finally, the question about one's sex can be changed has been asked. Right? My response is no. Sex is the potential role one plays in reproduction. Again, potential. The human is sexed from the very beginning of its life, and its growth involves, among other things, developing capacities that it has. Right? Okay? Humans are not sequential hermaphrodites. Right? Our sexes are different individuals. If humans could change sex, we could change reproductive role, but we can't. So you may have heard of so-called sex reassignment surgeries. I think that's a misnomer because you can't change sex. Okay? But they will involve, for example, if the individual is male, castration, removal of the penis, an attempt to use the surrounding tissue to create a simulated vagina. Right? And then that male may also take drugs to suppress his testosterone, which is naturally generated by testicles, but also the adrenal gland, which lies above the kidneys. That is not a sex change. That is actually a mutilation. Okay? Because a simulated penis can't do what a real penis does. On the female side, such surgeries may involve removal of the breasts, removal of the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, and an attempt to create a penis from the surrounding tissue. Right? But that's not a real penis, right? It can't play the role that a real penis does. A simulated vagina and simulated penises can't play the role their real counterparts do. Right? A genuine sex change for me should involve the possibility that my sex organs are now oriented towards production of ova. And that doesn't happen, right? I could change on the surface, much my anatomy, but that's not a sex change. And likewise, for a female, a genuine sex change should involve transitioning to the possibility that her reproductive organs could produce sperm. And that can't happen. Right? So my second conclusion is that the sex body isn't external to the self. It's an essential part of the person. Right? Some attributes and events aren't essential to us to be who we are. Okay? Your life probably wouldn't have gone very differently if you were 0.5 centimeters taller or shorter than you actually are. On the other hand, if you were a foot taller or shorter than you actually are, your life may have been very different, of course. Right? Right? I don't need to alpha criteria about which events are essential and attributes are essential to us. I instead want to say that sex is so integral to our identity. It permeates our existence so thoroughly. You could not have been a different sex than you actually are. So if on February 14th, 1975, that's my birthday, at 2 o'clock in the morning, if Mei Ng, that's my mother, having given birth to a girl, not a boy, that person would nonetheless not have been me, even if that girl had gone on to the same school, developed very similar interests, right? And later moved to Saskatoon from Ottawa. That person could not have been me. Okay? Our sex is fundamental. Like, we don't think about our sex all the time, but it permeates our existence. We are sexed beings, right? The body, I need to emphasize, isn't a machine. I think this is what a lot of trans activists and theorists think, that you could just take out certain body parts and put others in. You could take out certain, certain fluids and put in others. Like you could change, in the same way one can substitute like Quaker State, motor oil for, I don't know, STP motor oil, and then you wouldn't have any serious effects. But the body isn't a machine. It's machine-like in many ways. We have, sure, artificial kneecaps, right? We can take drugs that, enhance our long-term memory, right? But in no way is the body thoroughly a machine, right? Testosterone affects males and females differently because of our difference in DNA, right? Some of you may have heard about the controversy in England and its reverberations will be felt here. The Hilary Cass, who was appointed by the government of England to investigate the state of gender medicine in England, has said that puberty blockers should not be prescribed to minors, right? In Canada, United States, the attitude is on a different end of the spectrum, and that there's going to be more battles between medical authorities. But if you think about it, that in puberty we're still developing, like the brain, bones, right, and other parts of our anatomy and physiology, right? To think that taking drugs to suppress the delay of puberty might have no long-term effects, I think that's really an ungrounded claim. And you'd have to think that prepubescent children, at least ones who have who have gender dysphoria, that is, they're confused about which gender identity they have, you'd have to think they have a right to delay the onset of puberty and a right to choose a different path. And that sounds to me very fantastic, that prepubescent children could have that right. Our anatomies and physiologies are inherently directed towards some ends and not others. Okay? Even if you don't fulfill a reproductive role, you have one. And that non-fulfillment could be your choice or a result of a genetic error, right? You're unable to produce sperm or ova. But the whole body plan is nonetheless oriented in one direction or another, but not both. Okay? Yeah, that's a chart on, I should point out that, testosterone isn't generated in males just by the testicles. Our adrenal gland also makes it. Adrenal gland is located above the kidneys. And women have some testosterone in their system as well, and men have some estrogen. But testosterone is much higher in males than it is in females. And that accounts for a lot of our physical advantage, right? And I bring this up because we are witnessing debates for whether or not biological females can compete in women's categories. Okay? You don't have as much debate about whether or not biological females can compete in men's categories, right? When boys go through puberty, testosterone is the driver, and they start outpacing girls in height, in musculature, right? And that effect is not reversible. So the claim that, for example, a biological female should be able to compete in women's sports because he's taking testosterone suppressants, well, the advantage he has was already acquired during puberty. Okay? So testosterone suppression doesn't eliminate all that male advantage acquired during puberty. And that is all I have to say. Sex is complicated, but it's also binary. Thank you. I know it's late, and I can take questions, and I can also, chat with folks.
Available for chatting. Yes,
Yeah.
Clement is spending the evening here, so he is.
I don't have to get up at a certain time, so yeah. So yeah, I'm happy to field questions. I want to note that I'm not a biologist by training. I've studied this material at length for quite some time now, but I'm not a biologist by training. Okay, but go ahead. Yes. Can you say your name, by the way?
Jeremiah.
Okay.
I don't know if this question is too biological, but with the theory that if you could properly change your sexual orientation from male to female, and it was say that it did fully work and that you could actually have the female reproductive system completely follow through, wouldn't that not, because the DNA wouldn't change with the rest of the body, correct? Because there would be different DNA structures of that organism going to the body, would there be probably...
There would be different DNA, yeah.
So would that cause more issues than...
Well, it's not even possible in the first place. First of all, the term sexual orientation usually refers to attraction, right? Homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, or the standard sexual orientations. For a sex change to occur, in say me, I would need to be able to start producing eggs, and I need to have a uterus and fallopian tubes. My chromosome set 46XY doesn't allow for that, right? I mean, I have the SRY gene on my Y chromosome, and it acts with the other genes on the other 44 chromosomes, right? Because you actually need 2 X chromosomes for proper development of the ovaries. Now, what would have become my testicles can become very ovary-like if I had a condition like congenital androgen insensitivity, right? Where the protogonads weren't stimulated to go in a certain direction. Still, I'm genetically male, my body plan is pointed in a certain direction, but I had female appearance, because I didn't have testosterone, I'm going to not develop the same sort of musculature, not that I have a lot of muscles, and height that I have now, right? So again, I know that chart on the development of the gonads and genitalia was, probably struck a lot of people as really confusing, and I can talk again about that. But the sex is determined at conception. It is possible for someone to be genetically male and have a female phenotype, female appearance. That doesn't make sex non-binary, though. We can ask whether or not, which's more fundamental, the genetics or the appearances. You can't have appearances without the genes, right? So on the genetic basis, we need our DNA to be, a DNA is what makes, for the human body, right? So cases of sex change, for example, discussed in philosophical literature, are really cases of mind change. There was this movie a few years back with comedian Rob Schneider, and he's a man. He wakes up one morning, he's a woman's body, right? But that's like imagining that your mind was transported from one place to the other. Not the brain, I should say, but the mind, right? So a sex change isn't possible given our genetics. So we're not like the fish, like the clownfish, right? whose the male and female forms aren't differentiated very much, right? And we don't typically think of fish as sexed, but they are, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, I'm happy to chat with folks later, but I know it's 9 o'clock, but go ahead.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
You were talking about mitochondrial transfer,
Mm-hmm.
where there's one female who is a donor for kind of the outside shell of the egg,
Mm-hmm.
and another female is the donor for the genetics.
Yep.
Still, like genetically speaking, that child would only have two parents, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
just the
Because there's no third gamete. You know, there is mitochondria taken from a second mother, but there's no third gamete, right? Sorry, no third gamete type. Okay, there were 3 gametes involved, but no third gamete type. There was 2 eggs and 1 sperm, right? So that doesn't make for 3 parents if what we mean by parent is someone who can generate a specific gamete type, right? Okay.
but the child would not be genetically related to the donor mother, right?
No, because most of these, and again, I'm not a biologist, most of the genes that, for example, control for hair color or, I don't know, facial hair are in the nuclear DNA, not in the mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of a cell. You can't have mitochondrial disorders, right? And mitochondrial DNA is like less than 1% of the total DNA in the human genome, right? But there's no 3 parents if what we mean is a one parent gave a third gamete type, right?
Okay, well, let us give Clement another round of applause. Okay, enjoy the rest of your night.
If anyone wants to access presentation, please let me know, right? I can make available these slides along with, what I didn't close the presentation with is other resources, but you're free to contact me about that, so.